Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we are changing the mental health narrative, bringing hope and solutions. Here's your host, Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist.
Pierre Pradervand studied at the universities of Geneva, Bern, and the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, before receiving a doctorate in sociology from La Sorbonne University in Paris. A true world citizen, Pierre has labored most of his life for social justice while living, working, studying in, or visiting 40 countries on every continent. From his Geneva home, Pierre is now active as a writer, speaker, and life coach, helping people to live simpler, yet richer, more contented lives. He provides personal development tools that empower attendees to strengthen their internal anchors and advance on their spiritual path. Pierre is also an independent celebrant for weddings, burials, and other events. He is the author of more than 20 books, including The Gentle Art of Blessing and 365 Blessings to Heal Myself and the World. His most recent book is titled The Gentle Art of Spiritual Discernment. And I'll say hello and launch into asking you about your new book.
Okay, well, I was brought up in a very strict Calvinist family and church, and everything was so rigorous, and the whole theology was dominated by this concept of sin, or so it seemed to me. This wasn't so much my father. My father was a wonderful, wonderful man, of whom I have kept the most incredible positive souvenir, but it was the church and the parish and all that stuff. And in high school, in the college, there was a biblical group that was, so closed. And we were praying for our fallen brethren, all those who weren't in the Bible group. These were fallen brethren. I mean, it was so pathetic. And then I did 2 years theology and completely quit the whole stuff. And for 10 years, I wandered in sort of spiritual desert. And I came to Ann Arbor to prepare my doctorate. And there I was going to 3 different groups, the Quakers, and a remarkable group that few people remember. It was called the Word of God. And I don't know if you remember, in the 70s and 80s, the late 60s and early 70s, a tremendous revival in Christian churches all around the United States. And this petered off. But it started with 4 young students at the University of Michigan praying that the Spirit would descend on the campus. And when I arrived, it was one of the largest student movements on campus in Michigan. The University of Michigan in Ann Arbor was a very large university. And when I left, it was the largest student movement on campus. And it was just amazing. I remember hearing somebody speaking in tongues in that movement, and I can still see the person, hear what he says in tongues, and it's the most beautiful music I've ever heard in my life. Ever. The most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life. And immediately after, somebody translated what he had said into normal English, and it was fabulous. And then I started going also to a spiritual healing movement, and I was a total hypochondriac at the stuff. At the time, I'd grown up in a family where the family doctor was a sort of little god and totally dependent on medicine. And I was hearing these testimonies of students, breaking their leg and walking quite normally after 3 days without anything on their leg whatsoever. And these were amazing testimonies, and I started going to this group regularly and then belonged to the movement for a good many years. But it was something called Christian Science. I stayed a long time because of the healing and had myself very many amazing healings. But I left finally because it was so closed, and they had the sense of being the highest revelation in history. And boy, that is so terrible, such a weight. So I left, and then I won't say wandered, but I didn't belong to any movement of any sort, but I was still a very keen spiritual seeker. And now I think I found my my own practice of spirituality. But I've started in the last 2 years attending the Quaker group in Geneva because I just so love staying 1 hour in silence in a group. It's not at all the same as having silence in your own room in the morning. I have a lot of that. But silence in a group has a kind of substance that I love dearly. But I'd say I'm my own spiritual seeker. I cannot declare a sort of statement of faith as many big religions have, but I had two experiences, I'd say mystical experiences, that are the basis of my spirituality. And I don't know if I shared them in my earlier talks with you. One was on a plane, this experience of love. Well, maybe I'll repeat them in any case, because as you asked me what my spiritual practice is, this is the basis. I was coming back from Africa, where I was one of the co-founders of what was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the largest grassroots peasant movement in the whole of Africa, called the 6S movement in the Sahel. And I was one of the founding members. And I enjoyed the meetings of the governing body, which I was a member. And the last day of the meeting, I caught dysentery. Now, at the beginning, it's not a problem. If you don't take care of it, it can become serious. But I was working with my metaphysical formulas, my statements, as I usually did when I had any physical problem, instead of running to a doctor. And it seemed to have calmed down in the evening, but the next day going to the airport, it started over again. And on the plane, I was sitting next to a young, unaccompanied boy, studying my mantras, my texts, my prayers, and all the things I usually do in such cases. And the stewardess taking care of the little boy was so loving. I'm just one who thought she was his mother. She always came to check if he was okay. And at one moment, she came to speak to him in a especially, I'd say, tender way. And I felt for this woman an incredible gratitude, which suddenly became literally a cosmic gratitude. And then I had an out-of-body experience. I'm sure you know what that is.
Yes.
I was no longer in the plane. I was in a space where there was only the most incredible, unconditional love. Love was the only power, the only law, the only presence, the only substance, the only reason of everything, and was just phenomenal. I don't know how long it lasted, because I was out of time, out of space. And the most wonderful thing is that Pierre Pradervand had completely disappeared. I had no sense whatsoever of having an ego, a little Swiss passport and all that. I was just one with this incredible love, which was the solution to all problems. And then suddenly I came back in the plane. I felt something move in my lower stomach and my entrails, and the dysentery disappeared in a matter of seconds. But the real healing was my vision of the word. The next mystical experience, the second one, was just a couple of years ago. I was reading a book by the American mystic Joel Goldsmith. I'm sure you've heard of him.
Yes.
And he was a very prolific writer and speaker at the time he was alive, traveled all over the world. And I was rereading for the fourth time his book, simply called Spiritual Healing, the art of spiritual healing. And there's one place in the book where he speaks of he'd received 35 calls for assistance the evening before and that morning. And he was in his office in town, and he constantly had patients all day long, including between 12 and noon and 1 o'clock. And he looked into his agenda, and for the first time ever, he did not have one single appointment between 12 and 1 o'clock. And he thought, oh, it's up there that they've organized this, that's the divine will,
right,
to organize this. Why? For what reason? And he thought, well, it's just to plunge into silence. And he plunged into silence. And when he came out of it an hour later, he received calls over the next moments from almost every single person who'd asked for help in the past, in the present afternoon and evening. And they'd almost every single one had been healed. And he did not work for one single one of them.
He just went into the silence.
Yes. And so he explains this, and it touched me so deeply. I thought, oh, I would so like to get into this quality of silence. And so I just plunged into silence and had another amazing experience. Suddenly I was in a space of just perfect harmony and joy and beauty, lots of greenery, and just quotes, heaven or perfection, whatever you want to call it. And of course, again, the ego had completely disappeared. And there was just this sense of all-pervading harmony saying, Pierre, that's where it really is at. That's real reality. And I came back, I don't know how long later, and I've just stayed with this ever since. So that is, I'd say these two experiences are my basic sense of spirituality, that everything is governed by love, and love is the fundamental law of the universe, both in general terms and in individual terms, and a sense that behind the material veil of things, there is only perfect harmony. And Joel Goldsmith was an amazing healer, because he says that when he started working for someone, let's say he receives a phone call, the first thing he does is forget the name of the person who called him and the problem they were calling about. And he just plunged into the silence and contact this sense of perfection, and people were healed.
And that is very similar to what you were doing for years with your Christian Science work.
Yes, but I didn't do it for other people.
Right.
At all.
Right. But that's what you were doing for yourself. And
I was doing it for myself, but then the movement was very narrow and exclusive, and that's what I couldn't put up with, and that's why I left. Joel Goldsmith didn't belong to any movement.
Right.
He created his own teaching called The Infinite Way, and he's got a book called The Infinite Way, and many other books of his that anyone can find on internet. But what I loved is that he said he completely forgot the name of the person who called him and what the problem was, and just went into this sense of perfection where everything is already okay, and contacted that level of being so concretely that automatically the person was healed. He's the only person I study, I receive every day, I receive a short text of his on internet. And I'd say I don't belong to any movement, religion of any sort, but I do follow and study the work of God because he speaks very strongly to me. That's all.
And you decided to write this book to help others, if they're going out on their own spiritual path, to have some kinds of general guidelines, things, pitfalls to avoid, and tools they might use. And one of the things that strikes me is that you talk about the spiritually transmitted diseases. I thought that was quite cute. And they're basically the pitfalls to watch out for. Absolutely.
But the main thing I think I'd like to say is that there is no rigid path, no fixed path. Religions are every single religion is a human construction, a social construction. Jesus didn't leave any guidelines for any kind of structure. And when one studies the history of the church, one can see how the church until the 3rd century was There was no really rigid organization of any sort. And then in any movement, you have people who take positions of power, of guidance, of dominance. And the early members of these early churches thought they would like to organize this a little more rather than having little groups here and there. And the church developed, and they developed their own criteria of who could become a member and who could not, which had nothing to do, or very, very little, with the teachings of Jesus. So churches were a purely human construction, and I say this with great respect. My father, bless him, was for a quarter of a century the General Secretary of the World Presbyterian Alliance, as it was called at that time. And he visited churches all around the globe. And he was amazing. Wherever he was, he would write a handwritten email letter back to the family. And this was amazing because it had deep impact on me. You know, I was raised in a nice little bourgeois family in suburban Geneva with a lovely garden and great peace and no problems of any sort. He'd send these letters. And I remembered, as of today, our mother always used to read them standing up in the kitchen when we came back from school. And I still remember the letter he wrote from Mexico City, saying he'd been in a part of the city where no girl above 12 was a virgin because they were all prostituting themselves to earn money for families which lived in utter and dire poverty. And wow, that was one of my greatest awakenings in life, realizing that everybody didn't
live the way you did, yeah.
Pampered little living in sweet little Geneva, peaceful Switzerland. No, some people had a hell of a life. And I think these letters of my father's, of our fathers, awoke me to the world and made me, they were the first buddings of becoming a world citizen.
Which you've certainly done in over 40 countries and
exactly,
and 5 or more continents.
Very different cultures. I mean, 12 years in Muslim cultures, in Arabic culture, Black African culture, which are very, very totally different from our nice little middle-class Switzerland. So I'm grateful. And I've lived in the United States. I lived 10 years in England. And these are very, very different cultures, too.
And as you're talking about in the book, you decided to write this book because you've become more and more aware, and without actual hard statistics, but it's your awareness that fewer people are flocking to the churches and more people are pursuing their spiritual path on their own.
Exactly. I mean, it's so evident that, at least in Europe, the churches are more and more empty. And I believe, as I say in the book, that sooner or later organized religions will disappear, with the possible exception of Judaism for very specific reasons, because it is totally tied to a people and a territory. And maybe Islam will be one of the large religions which will probably resist longest, I think. But by and large, I think we are evolving, as everybody's aware, towards ever higher levels of consciousness. And one will be that nobody can tell you what right living is. You are the only one to be able to find it out for yourself, if it's authentically you. Now, many people live chained to beliefs and structures their whole life because they haven't been able to free themselves from these structures.
Well, and what you said about your upbringing was similar to mine in the way that I had a very nice family, very loving parents, and my parents and my grandparents were all of the same Roman Catholic religion. So there was a whole level at which the only thing I had been exposed to was that Roman Catholic religion. It's like what you were talking about with the Christian Science movement. The only people they allow in their churches are the Christian Science speakers that are on a circuit, and
Exactly.
and it gets to be, you know, this restrictive thing.
Inbred,
The
totally inbred.
the Roman Catholic movement was so rigid when I was growing up that they told us, don't even read the Bible because you'll misinterpret it. Just go to the priest and ask questions. And I remember several times in school, I would go and ask the nuns, and they'd say, "Oh, we can't answer that. We have to ask Father." So it was all this very narrow funneling of this one kind of a mindset. So by the time I went to college, all I knew of basically was the Roman Catholic Church. I didn't know anything about the Jewish people or their religion. I didn't know anything about the Muslims. And so up until that time, even though I was very much um, desiring to be a good person and to be in alignment with whatever was divine, I had some very, very narrow definitions for what that might be. And boy, did it explode once an education arrived. And when that happens, I think it's a wonderful thing to have a book like yours to give someone some you know, like the guardrails. Well, yeah, they're just the guardrails on the highway, right? They don't tell you which exit to get off of, but they keep you from going off a bridge or, you know, in some horrible danger. And some of the tools that you mentioned, I think that lately the word intention has been a big theme that's come across in the work that I've been doing on the internet show and in our support groups. And you've got a wonderful story about intention with Mohan.
Yes.
Can you share
Sarala, the young man.
Share a little bit about your thoughts about intention and how that story weaves into that?
For me, my intention is just to be love one day, just to express love in everything, in every thought. I have a little saying I go over quite a few times during the day. Creator, bless my mind that every one of my thoughts may come from love. Bless my ears that I hear everything through the channel, the listening of love. Bless my eyes that all I see may be seen with love and bathed in love. Bless my mouth that my every thought, every word come from love. Bless my heart that I may give and receive love. Bless my hands that everything I touch feels loved and everything I do is done with love. And bless my feet that I may walk with love and peace upon the earth. That's something I like to repeat during the day, and I'd say it's the summary of my spirituality.
It helps.
It's not I believe in this or that. It's applied love. For me, that's the only reason.
And it helps you keep your intention,
of course,
focused.
Of course. And again, I like to repeat that I'm a student and still in the first grade primary school of spiritual path, just a little learner. But what I have learned has given such joy and depth to my life. I want to continue.
Well, and as you talk about in the book, the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know.
Yes.
That there's, great expanses like when you have an experience like you did on the plane, or like you did when reading the Joel Goldsmith work, you realize there aren't even any words for what you've tapped into and just touched,
Exactly.
And so intention is so important that can you relay the story of Rohan and Sarala?
Oh, it's one of my favorite stories. Thanks for asking me, Tim. There was a seeker in India who was called Mohan, who worked. Finally, for many years, he sought for a teacher that could really get him on the road. And finally, he found one, and he stayed with him many years, working in his fields, in the master's fields, keeping the cows in the day, as was the tradition, and studying at the feet of the master in the evening. And one day the master passed on, and Mohan hit the road again, looking for right teacher. And one day he arrives in a village completely exhausted and famished, and practically collapses. And the villagers take care of him, putting back him into good shape. And as they had no Brahmin in the village, they asked Mohan if he would stay in the village, that they would take care of him, and that he would be able to teach the young people. And Mohan is delighted with this proposition, and he does just that. And there was one young man in the village called Sarala, who had decided that Mohan was the teacher he was seeking for his whole life. And he would do all the errands he could for Mohan, and he would always be prowling around Mohan's hut to the point that it really irritated Mohan, who thought Sarah was a rather simplistic fellow. He'd never get very far spiritually. And unbeknownst to Mohan, Sarala slept on the doorstep of Mohan's hut, because what he was awaiting was the famous mantra. You know, the mantra in India is something very, very important on the spiritual path. And every serious student receives the mantra from his teacher. And Mohan wakes up in the middle of the night and feels the need to go to the toilet, which was just in the fields, of course. And his foot hits Sarala on the doorstep. And Sarala wakes up and jumps up. And Mohan, really irritated, say, "Go out of the village." No, the first thing he says, always you. Go out of the village and don't come back until I call you. And Sarala is quite convinced that the always you is the famous mantra. He'd been waiting. And he runs out of the village, his hut, singing with joy, always you, always you. And he travels for days, for weeks, for months, for years, with nothing else in his mind but always you, always you, always you. And one day he arrives in a village where a widow has just lost her only son, a teenager. And in India, the situation of widows, has always been very difficult, and especially if they had no other children. This was her only son, and they put a pyre. I think you say pyre where you burn people.
Right.
And
funeral pyre.
He was on top of the pyre, and Sarah arrives, and the people feel something so special in this man. He radiates a light, a gentleness. And they ask him, could you pray for the resurrection of this boy? And Sarala says, look, I've never resurrected anyone, but I can repeat the mantra my teacher Mohan taught me. And unbeknownst to Sarala, he'd made a circuit of thousands of kilometers in India. It was just a few miles from his home village. And so he settles at the foot of the pyre and just plunges into this always you, always you. And suddenly the boy sits up, totally surprised to be on this pyre, and he climbs down, and the whole village shouts, "Miracle, miracle," and they all bring a few pennies, a necklace, a piece of jewelry, a tiny piece of gold, whatever they had, and put it at the feet of Sarala. And Sarala says, my friends, it is not me you must thank. It is my teacher, Mohan, who taught me this mantra. And as I said a moment ago, the village was very close to Mohan's village, and the villagers ran off to Mohan, and they all arrive at the same time at his house, and they're all shouting and explaining, and Mohan can't understand anything. And he says all he gets is that one of his students supposedly had raised someone
Right from the dead, right?
He knew perfectly well he was totally incapable himself of doing anything like that, and he couldn't think of any one of his students who would ever be capable of this. And so he asked the villagers, what is this student's name? They say Sarala. And suddenly one remembers he had a student years ago called Sarala, and he tells them, go and tell Sarala that I'm awaiting him. And the villagers all run back. Sarala had left. He was on the road, but it was very easy to catch him up. And villagers tell Sarala, your teacher, Mohan, asks you to come back. And you remember Mohan had told Sarala, never come back until I call you. Sarala, for him it was the perfect day, the day of illumination. His teacher had called him back. And he hurries back to Mohan and falls at the feet of Mohan. And Mohan gently raises him up. And he says, the villagers tell me that you raised a young boy from the dead. Oh, Master, I did nothing but repeat the mantra you told me, always you. And suddenly, Mohan remembers that famous night. He hears
tripped on him.
Yell in anger when he trips on Sarala. Always you. Go from village and never come back until I call you. And here he was. And in a moment of incredible humility, maybe the first in his life, Mohan falls at the feet of Sarala and looks up to his face and says, Master, teach me. That's my favorite spiritual story.
All about intention.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful tie-in to your little prayer of bless my thoughts, bless my ears, bless my eyes and my mouth, because if I'm choosing to see through the eyes of love and to hear everything through the filter of love, that's essentially what Sarala did.
Exactly.
Well, and the book has some wonderful stories. It's a rather brief book for your standards, but it is a beautiful collection of these stories. What's another part of the book that you'd like to highlight for us as we talk about the tools and or the spiritually transmitted diseases? Or
I coined these terms spiritually transmitted diseases because there are so many of them. You see, we are in a world as never before. So many teachings and paths and in all areas. And Byron Katie has said so rightly 40 years ago that the main problem in our society is not war or hunger or fighting in groups or political dissent. It's confusion. And I feel that this is a woman I admire greatly. I followed a workshop with her once in Geneva, and she's really for me I don't know, one says in English, the great dame of personal development in the United States, one of the greatest figureheads for me. And that statement is so true of our world. That's why and so many people are confused in all areas, including spirituality. And that's why one of the reasons I wrote this book is to give very simple guidelines to people so as that they could find their own spiritual path. For some, it will mean joining a movement, and for others, it'll just be like it has been for me now for years, following their own spiritual intuition. But of course, I spend a lot of time. I spend every morning, normally at least an hour and a half, preparing spiritually for the day. And then constantly through the day, trying to remind myself to come back to love, as in the little story I told a little moment ago. For me, it's so simple. True spirituality is so simple. And when you read the gospel, Jesus didn't develop any kind of theology of any sort. He gave very simple statements, and left us incredible promises, but always so simple.
And that simplicity can help as an antidote to your confusion.
Absolutely. Of course.
And the big thing that what I get from your book that comes across so clearly is that, and you talk about how the religions are primarily based on looking outside yourself to some kind of an authority figure.
Exactly.
And that what you're recommending is kind of a series of guidelines people can use to find their way in to the guidance that's going to come from their own heart center.
To be their own authority. And when I say to be their own authority, I'm not pampering the ego, because this happens when the ego has been reduced to its smallest dimension. And then when you become your own authority, it's not to the ego of Pierre Pradervand, for instance, it's to the highest vision that Pierre has, and that is one of infinite love.
Yeah, and you talk about that as necessarily feelings-based, not thought-based.
Oh, absolutely. Because I was brought up in a religion. We had to believe things this way and that. And it was all on the level of mind, and nothing on the level of the heart. I hardly ever heard the word heart pronounced. And for me, it is the center of authentic spirituality. It is in the heart, not in the brain.
What other point or a couple points do you want to make to try and kind of whet people's appetite for this book, the gentle art of discernment for your spiritual?
Well, I would say, I live more and more in a permanent sense of gratitude, not only because I live in a peaceful country. I have a lovely little apartment in a beautiful little garden. I earn a very, very modest income, but it's sufficient. That's a choice I made. It's sufficient to live the simple life, which has been my ideal for close to 60 years now. And I find constantly opportunities for gratitude and expressing appreciation. So often I will say to sales girl in a supermarket, thank her for that, her smile or her gentleness. I thank the bus driver for having driven us safely. And people are not used to that. And I remember a sales lady to whom I said something especially nice. I don't remember exactly, but she said, in 30 years in the job, nobody has ever said something like that to me. So a simple word of appreciation is just so limitless. And you don't know what it can mean to someone. And it can become a sort of sport, trying to find opportunities to express appreciation. And of course, it always comes from the heart and never from the mind. So I live in constant gratitude, because I mean, really, hour by hour. A little while I was in my garden. I had lunch in my garden, and I felt such gratitude because it's a beautiful day and everything was quiet and green, and just you can invent so many opportunities to say thank you and to feel grateful.
I hear in my mind, as I've had several times over the years, many, many times over the years, when I talk about that or somebody else talks about that, that the ego or the other chattering mind wants to say, well, yeah, but that's because you have this beautiful apartment and this simple life and it's peaceful. And yet you have firsthand experience with some dark night of the ego. So a lot of people call it dark night of the soul, but from the Way of Mastery, it talks about it's not really the dark night of the soul. It's the awakening of the soul, and it's the dark night of the ego.
Exactly.
And you talk about people like Roger McGowan and how he's had really extraordinarily challenging and abusive situations, and he's learned the benefit of practicing gratitude and your blessing practice.
Exactly.
So it's not an empty thing that is useful only if my life is going well. It's a very powerful tool for the darkest times as well.
Exactly.
How did you come
my
to
dark times like everybody?
And you talk about that some in this book.
13 years ago, I was crazy enough to leave the most wonderful woman in the world, my wife, and I went through absolute total hell. For 4 years, I was in a deep depression. And today I have again very good, warm relations with this person who is the person I admire most on the whole planet, because she runs a foundation for women and children at 83. She's running world campaigns. It's just incredible. So I say, all I can say now for everything is thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
How did you first come to know of Roger McGowan? How did you get involved with him?
Well, it's very simple. In 1996, one of his correspondents in Zurich contacted me at the suggestion of a friend of hers. And I don't know at all why she contacted me. I don't know why this gentleman gave her my name, because I'd never heard of Roger McGowan. I'd never had anything to do with the death penalty. And Texas Department of Criminal Justice had just fixed a date of execution to put him to death. And she'd been corresponding with him for years. And she thought, that cannot be. And she started looking for people to contribute to the hiring of a lawyer. And the story she told me touched me so deeply, I put a few thousand, I think $3,000 into her account so that we could hire a lawyer. And she managed to put off the date of execution, but not the death penalty. And I started corresponding with Roger because the story she told me moved me so much. And immediately our correspondence took on a very special light for me. And after 2-3 years, I thought, I can't keep these letters for myself. They belong to the cultural heritage of humanity. And I have an extraordinary publisher, really amazing man who's never refused a single manuscript I've presented him in 25 years. And he accepted to publish a book that was totally out of anything he'd ever published. And the book was a real success. People started sending in money. One woman sent in $50,000 just from reading that book. So deeply she was touched.
Is that book The Messages of Life from Death Row?
Exactly. And so we were able to hire a good lawyer who got him off death row. And because the lawyer was able to challenge the death penalty. And now he's in another prison. And he's changing a prison of 2,500 inmates. And over the years, this book has had such an incredible impact. I received some time ago a letter from Thailand, from an African inmate in the Bangkwang Central Prison, which is the worst prison in Thailand. And he'd been incarcerated there also, as he tells me, for a crime he had not committed. And he was at the depth of depression, the depth of hell. And Now tell me, by what miracle he finds Roger's book in French in Bangkok Central Prison in Thailand. Only somebody up there, as I say in French, on the first floor would be able to explain. And that book totally transformed him, pulled him out completely out of his state of depression. And he wrote to me, and now he has different correspondence, and there's been a sort of amnesty. And a friend of mine who corresponds with him still now told me he's just out of prison. But what was amazing was the impact of Roger's book. And I see Roger, I've been visiting him every single year since 1999. And he has become one of my two closest friends.
And a spiritual teacher to many.
Absolutely. And to me also. A spiritual example. From when we first met in the early century, he used to say, Pierre, you pulled me forward. And now the roles have been reversed for quite a few years. He pulls me and many, many others forward.
Wonderful. And of course, you mentioned him in, I'm not sure if you mentioned him in the Gentle Art of Blessing, but certainly in the 365 Blessings to Heal Myself and the World.
Yes.
And all three of these books, the Gentle Art of Blessing, 365 Blessings to Heal Myself and the World, and your newest book on the Gentle Art of Spiritual Discernment, is due to be released in July of this year, 2023. So I'm really looking forward to that. And the next few books you write as your moves too.
That will come. My next book, as a matter of fact, I started this morning, will be Living Without Judging. I'm writing it in French. I don't know if I'll find an American publisher, but it's a topic that's very close to my heart, and one that I live completely. I live literally without judging, because I found, and it's so simple once you found not the trick, but the attitude.
Tool. It's a tool.
The tool is to realize that every single person, including Trump and Putin, are at their highest level of judgment, given the circumstances of their life, their past history, and everything. So when you really see that, well, you cannot judge anymore.
Well, and especially when you have some insight, you have some experience to, those, you said, out-of-body experience or those spiritual experiences, when you get an inkling that there is so much more going on here than you have any idea about, then you realize at a new level how silly it is to judge.
Exactly.
Because you have nothing really to base it on except this very limited sphere of perception.
Exactly.
And I'm excited to hear about that book. We've been talking about this idea of judgment. I was interviewing a young woman who's written a couple of really nice books about ending her addictive process and putting together a healthy, vibrant life. And in the second interview, I found myself talking about this addiction we have to judging, and how for every other addiction, we realize, whatever the drug, that we really need to abstain from it. And so what would it be like for me to abstain from judging? We're talking about that. What kind of tools can I put in place to help myself recognize when I've judged and then choose to release it?
Yes.
So I will look forward to your book with great relish.
Good.
Have you got a closing blessing for us that we can send people off with? One of your favorite?
I'll compose one now. I don't have,
I was thinking, do you remember the one for this, the blessing you have in the book for spiritual seekers?
No, I don't remember. Out of 365 blessings, I can't remember.
Well, so if you would be so kind, could you compose a blessing for us to end today?
I bless you in your listening to the guidance from above. I bless you in the deep sincerity of your quest for finding your own spiritual path. I bless you in your deep understanding that whatever the path you choose, it starts by loving yourself unconditionally. Whatever the path, be it a special brand of Sufism or some esoteric Christian or Buddhist branch of this or that movement, before anything else, your path, your first path, is one of learning to love yourself. Because when you love yourself, you let go of so many weights that could hamper your search for your own spiritual path, your own spiritual teaching. May you be blessed, infinitely blessed, as you are on your path. There we are.
Well, thank you so much. And may you be blessed in your path and your intention and your prolific writing, which has blessed us all.
I am, Tim. Thank you for this moment of sharing. Goodbye.
Thank you. Blessings. Pierre Pradervand studied at the universities of Geneva, Bern, and the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, before receiving a doctorate in sociology from La Sorbonne University in Paris. A true world citizen, Pierre has labored most of his life for social justice while living, working, studying in, or visiting 40 countries on every continent. From his Geneva home, Pierre is now active as a writer, speaker, and life coach, helping people to live simpler, yet richer, more contented lives. He provides personal development tools that empower attendees to strengthen their internal anchors and advance on their spiritual path. Pierre is also an independent celebrant for weddings, burials, and other events. He is the author of more than 20 books, including The Gentle Art of Blessing and 365 Blessings to Heal Myself and the World. His most recent book is titled The Gentle Art of Spiritual Discernment.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.